It was a sunny summer day. My 5-year-old son James was playing in the backyard. James had always been a quiet boy with a wild imagination. But he was a bit of a lonely soul. He never had many friends. I was in the kitchen feeding our dog when I heard James talking to someone in the backyard. Was it a friend? I decided to go out to see how he was doing. When I reached the backyard, I was a little confused. James was the only person there. Was he talking to himself? I swear I heard another voice. At that moment, I called him. He came in and sat at the kitchen table. I made him a turkey sandwich and he began to eat it silently. "Who were you talking to before?" I asked. James looked up for a moment. "I was playing with my new friend," he said, smiling. I served him some milk and kept asking, "Does your friend have a name? Why don't you ask him if he wants to come eat with us?" James looked at me for a moment before answering. "His name is Laughing Jack." "Oh, really? That's a strange name. And what does your friend look like?" "He's a clown. He has long hair and a big nose, long arms and big pants, with the striped socks, and he's always smiling." At that moment, I realized that my son was talking about an imaginary friend. I assumed that it was normal for boys his age to have imaginary friends, especially if there were not many real ones to play with. I didn't give it much thought. It must be a phase. The rest of the day went by as usual. It was night and I put James to bed. I tucked him in, kissed him goodnight, and made sure to turn on his lamp before closing the door. I was very tired. It was hard to be a single mother. I went to bed and I had a horrible nightmare. It was all dark. I was in a kind of weird abandoned street fair running like crazy. I was very scared. The whole place looked horrible, black and white. There were stuffed animals hanging on ropes in the booths with sickly smiles sewn on their faces. I felt as if hundreds of eyes were looking at me, even though there was no one in sight. Suddenly, I began to hear the music of the children's song, "Pop Goes the Whistle." I was hypnotized. I followed the tune to the circus tent, almost in a trance. It was completely black. The only light came from a projector that shone in the center of the big tent. While walking towards the light, I found myself singing the song, unable to stop myself. All around the cobbler's bench, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought he was all in fun. Pop goes the weasel. The lights came on suddenly, leaving me almost blind. All I could see was a small dark silhouette coming towards me. Then another appeared, and another, and another. There were dozens of them. I couldn't move. I was frozen. The silhouettes were children. But they were horribly disfigured and mutilated. Some had cuts all over their bodies, others had burns, and others had their limbs mutilated, even the eyes. The children caught me and scratched me, dragged me to the ground, and tore my insides. As the children did all that to me, all I could hear was a laugh, a horrible and evil laugh. I passed out. I woke up the next morning, sweating all over. I sat up and noticed that some of James' action figures looked at me from my night table. James had probably woken up early and put his toys there. I picked up his toys and headed to James' room. He was sound asleep. How strange. I placed the toys and headed to the living room. James woke up a little dazed. Maybe he hadn't slept well either. I gave him his breakfast. "James, did you put the toys in Mom's room this morning?" "Laughing Jack did it." "Well, tell Jack that he has to pick them up after playing." James nodded and finished his breakfast. He went to play in the backyard. I was so tired that I sat on the couch for a moment and fell asleep. When I woke up a couple of hours later, I realized that James was alone. Shit. I went to the backyard, but James was not there. I started calling him, "James, James, where are you?" At that moment, I heard a small laugh coming from the front yard. James was sitting on the sidewalk. I breathed in relief. "James, how many times have I told you to stay in the backyard?" "Wait, what are you eating?" James looked at me and then reached into his pocket, pulled out a bunch of candies, many different colors. "Who gave you candies?" James looked at me without saying anything. "James, please, tell Mom who gave you the candy." James lowered his head and said, "Laughing Jack, he gave them to me. He was going to give me a heart attack." "James, I've had enough of this Laughing Jack. He is not real. I need to know who gave you those candies." James responded in all honesty. But Mom, Jack gave me the candies. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. I knew James would never lie to me, but what he was telling me was impossible. I had him spit out the candy. It seemed fine. Maybe some neighbor had given it to him. That night, we went to bed early. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. I ran downstairs. It was horrifying. Everything was lying on the floor. Our dog was dead and hanging from the lamp. His stomach was torn open and filled with colorful candies. I heard a loud scream coming from James's room. Ah! I grabbed a knife and ran up. Everything was on the floor. My poor son was in his bed crying and trembling with fear. I took him in my arms and we ran outside. We called the police from a neighbor's house. When I told them what had happened, they looked at me like I was crazy. They said probably someone had broken in to steal and escaped quickly after. I knew it wasn't true. What was in my house didn't come from outside. It was already inside. The next day, I didn't let James go out to the backyard. At night, I took the baby monitor to my room to watch him. James was afraid of Jack, poor boy. I promised him that nothing would happen to him. I went to bed with the biggest knife in the drawer and said, imaginary friend or not, I won't let anything harm my son. I tried to stay awake as long as I could, but in the end, sleep took over me. Is James asleep? I heard the horrible laugh from my nightmare. I jumped out of bed and quickly grabbed the knife. I ran to James' room. I felt a thick hot liquid on my feet. The light suddenly came on and I could see with absolute horror what was in front of me. My little James's body on the wall. I puked on the floor. I heard a grotesque laugh behind me. Turned around and from the shadows came the demon responsible for all this horror. It was Laughing Jack. His white skin and long black hair, penetrating white eyes and disheveled feathers on his shoulders. His body was gross, his long arms hanging beyond his waist. His crooked smile revealed a row of sharp white teeth. He wore a black and white suit like a clown with a long-sleeved shirt and striped socks. He let out a disgusting laugh. He approached James. Get away from him! I ran to the monster, raising the knife and stabbed him. But as soon as the knife touched him, he disappeared into a cloud of black smoke. The knife passed through James and bored him. James's heart was still beating, splashing his hot blood on my face. What have I done? My baby, my heart, I killed my baby. I immediately fell to my knees. I could hear the sirens in the distance, louder and louder. My son, my baby, my sweet baby. I promised that Mom would protect him, but I failed. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry. I bursted into tears, kneeling in front of what was still my son's body. The police soon arrived and found me holding the knife covered in the blood of my poor offspring. They blamed me for the murder of my son and declared me crazy. They locked me up where I've been for the past 2 months. The only reason I'm constantly awake is because someone is playing Pep Goes the Weasel outside my window. Every day, all the time. On the cobblestones, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought